All right, welcome everyone to my very special talk about my very special grandmother from the book we put together from her memoir, From Cowgirl to Congress. And she was the light of my life. And when I speak about her, I tear up as I'm starting to do now, because we were tied at the heart from when I was first born. And she took me under her fairy wing. She was my fairy godmother and taught me everything and loved me and fed me. I was a very poor child from a family who we often went to bed without dinner. And she gave me lots of food and love and especially imagination and ways to get things done. So anyway, I'm going to go to my PowerPoint about her. And she was the impetus and the inspiration for our wonderful, let me see, oh, I got it, good. Our wonderful book, The Cinderella Monologues. So anyway, now we've got four versions. I always put one of her stories in there. You know, she was a true Cinderella because she came from a terrible situation with incest and murder in her family. I could go into that more later. I don't think I should tell you the gory details today, but she grew up on a Colorado cattle ranch, and the way she explained it to me once when I was older, when maybe I could hear some of that, was that way out there in the middle of nowhere, there was no law. The man of the house was the king, and no one would question anything he did. And so she just kind of, had to suffer through a lot of things, do all the housework until she got off to college, which saved her. And so what happened was, I was going through her archives. I'm the archivist of the family, and everyone in the family sent me two tall file cabinets of all her history and all of her work. And I had it for a long time. I just put it in the garage. There was, I didn't go through it really. And then finally one day I started going through it and I remembered she had written a memoir and had not had any luck getting it published. And I found it. I found it in the raw form. I found it in a bound form. And I decided it was time to make her book into a, hold on, I want to put my little timer on. And I decided to put her into, oh, hold on a minute. Okay, anyway, I decided to make her into a book. But the problem was the book was 600 pages. And so we carved it down to 300 pages, 300 readable pages, and took out a lot of the stuff that someday I may put the real book in and have another book with everything in it, with all the women's names in that she taught and things that didn't need to be in this book. And so I started doing it. And about 6 months into it, I didn't realize before, for some reason, that the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote was coming up on August 18th, 2020. And I went, oh my gosh, get it in gear. Let's get the book done. Maybe that was a year ahead. And so I worked double hard. I hired someone to help me with the photos because there were hundreds of rare photos and invitations of her and other people. So we carved it down to 98. Sorry, I put my timer on. 98 rare pictures and invitations. And so we got it down to like really readable, really exciting, and we edited it. It's all her words, it's everything she said, but we had to take out 100 was words. We don't write with was words because they're not active. We want to have active language in our books now, so we have to use was words sometimes, but not too many. So I left probably half in and took half out. And now the book is 300 readable pages. And I got it out in March. So it must have been a year before. So I got it out in March, just as COVID hit. And I thought I'd be speaking in Pueblo, Colorado, where she was born, all over California, where I live, Washington, D.C., where she worked, London, where she worked, and I couldn't go anywhere. So I had to reinvent myself and learn Zoom and learn all this tech. But I had to sit here anyway, so why not? And then I started speaking all over the world, which I had no idea I could do on podcasts all over the world. India, Spain, England, Brazil. It was amazing. And I'm still doing it. I'm still speaking 1 to 4 times a week, following in her footsteps. She was a very famous speaker. She taught Eleanor Roosevelt public speaking and thousands of other women, and took me along in her early 90s when she spoke several times with Gloria Steinem, Marlo Thomas, and sometimes Jane Fonda was there, who I worked for later. So anyway, you can get your book right on Amazon if you don't already have it. I know many of you do. But that's the story of writing the book. And it let me feel close to her again because she had died like 20 years before that. And I loved her so deeply. And she loved me. And she would always say, you know, Mila, I think you're the only person who loves me because you're the only person who will tell me off. And we hung out all the time. And so that's how we were. Just anyway, here she is on her Pueblo, Colorado house with her father, her mother, her little sister, Emily, and Fred is missing. She had a brother, Fred, and he's in the house or something. And they're getting ready to go to church. You can see the Bibles in their hand. And there's Jessie on the left, all dressed up for church. And so anyway, she grew up in a very it was very poor. You know, you need to realize that her mother died when she was 10, and almost all the mothers died, she said, because there was no running water in the house, no toilets, and they just didn't make it. But her mother was a very, very educated woman. Here's Jessie as a baby, and here's Jessie as a young girl with her. And so anyway, I want to just double check a picture here. Anyway, so when she was a young girl at this age, she was about 10 years old. She had a funny story where she had her first foray into affecting women and telling them what they could be and inspiring them. She was 10 years old and she invited her class from Pueblo school out to the farm to go in the hay barn and ride horses. And most of them lived in the city, so it was very unique for them to come out. And she helped, her mother helped her create a beautiful picnic. And then they swung from the rope in the barn and landed on the hay. And then they started riding the horse in the apple orchard, but no one was watching because people didn't watch their kids back then as much. And they would stand on the horse and ride around, which they probably shouldn't have done. And then she said, let's go down to the river and swim. So when they got down to the river, it was the Yellow River. I think it's called the Yellow River. She said, you guys, the boys take off all their clothes and swim. Why don't we just take off all our clothes and go swimming? And they're all like, they didn't really want to. So she stripped down and jumped in, and pretty soon another girl did, and pretty soon they were all in the water with all their pastel dresses from the party lined up all over the bushes. One girl didn't. Her cousin, Edna, who was always sort of a prim, proper woman later, she wouldn't do it. And she just sat there and watched. And they all just started splashing and screaming and creating so much noise. Her mother should have come out, but they were so far down the river that she didn't hear her. And then suddenly one of the girls started feeling embarrassed, and she got out and got dressed. And pretty soon all the girls started feeling sheepish, and they all got dressed and they all went back to the house, and they all left without saying thank you to her. And she was devastated. And when she went to school, they snubbed her. And because all the mothers had had probably had probably, you know, were very upset with Jessie's mother for letting them do that, because you just didn't do that back then. And she talked to her mother about it, and her mother was so open because she had been a very educated woman. She said, well, Jessie, you do know it was dangerous down there because that has quicksand and we lose people down there all the time. What if one of those girls would have sunk into the quicksand? And so anyway, but she supported Jessie, and she didn't go after her too much. So this is Jessie's father, Edwin. And you know, he had issues, and he was good and bad, and who knows. But Emily was her sister, who ended up marrying a very rich man and going around the world 3 times. And I remember her as a child. She had Persian cats. She raised Persian cats. She had like 40 of them in cages in a garage. And she had a monkey living on a cage on top of her garage, which I thought was very interesting. And here's Jessie just when she's getting ready to go to Smith College. And her mother was, I'll be putting this in the new Cinderella book. Her mother was raised by a German Lutheran minister, and he was responsible for starting all the Lutheran churches across the whole top of the United States, all the way to Nebraska. And some of them, I looked it up, are still there. So he was very open to his daughter being educated. So her mother was very, very educated. And when she was 10 years old, a lot of this happened around then. Her mother took her to see Susan B. Anthony speaking out of the back of a wagon. And Jessie always told me, because she would tell me her stories over and over and over, 30 times for each story. She said she looked up into that woman's face and decided she wanted to be just like her and help and inspire other women. But when they came home, her father was mad that dinner wasn't ready. And her mother actually died right after that. She was 10, which you can imagine would be quite devastating. And so then Jessie had to do all the cooking for the ranch hands, all the dishes with her sister Emily, a lot of work. So she was always tired, but she knew she wanted to be a good student because she knew that would be her only way out of Pueblo. So she ended up being the valedictorian in her class. And the teacher saw how brilliant she was and helped her get into Smith College. And her father didn't want her to go to Smith College because he wanted her to stay home and take care of the ranch hands because his second wife had died and their small son. And there was no one left. And the teacher came to him and said, if you keep her here doing the cooking and cleaning that she's doing now, she will be dead in a year. And the teacher really got on him and forced him to allow Jessie to go to Smith College. And so he had to pay for her trousseau and some decent clothes, which weren't even decent enough when she got there. She was the dowdy one showing up. And so interestingly enough, she got on the train and she had always looked at the train from her house. Oh, someday I'll be on that train going somewhere. And when she got on the train, they stopped in Chicago and she got off on the platform with her trunks and she was waiting. And she looked around and all these beautiful mothers were bringing their daughters to the train with their trunks. And she thought, what would it be like if I had a mother like that? But she didn't persevere on it for too long because she was escaping the ranch and the work and was so excited to go somewhere. But guess what? They gave the Smith College girls their own train car and they all rode together to New York. And then she ended up at Smith College. And there she was in a play. It wasn't really her thing, so she didn't do very many of them, but that's her on the far right. You can see how pretty she was. She was always so gorgeous. And at Smith College, she loved it. The other girls complained about the food because they had cooks and maids and they were all very wealthy. But she was so happy she wasn't doing the cooking. She just ate it up and she thought it was delicious. And then she started riding a horse nearby and she would walk past this nylon factory where they were making silk stockings. And she saw all these women and children entering there. And they were all wearing tattered sweaters and clothes and it's freezing. I mean, it snows up there. And they were all going to work every day, rain, shine, snow, and they all looked miserable going in. And it really made her think. And it's interesting what happened to her later with that. So her first job after Smith, because she decided every summer she would take shorthand, typing, and dictation and secretarial skills. Someone told her to do that. And so she did. None of the other girls did it because they were wealthy. If you think about that movie, Monet's Smile or something with Julia Roberts, where the girls were all like, well, I'm going to get married. I don't really need to be educated. That's how they were. And she talks about it in the book. And so she would go home and get this training every summer. And when she was out of college, she went to a women's hiring firm. And the woman looked at her and said, oh my God, I'm so happy to see you. You're the first woman who came in with any skills. I have 10 jobs for you today. So the first job she sent her to was to go to Columbia University and help Professor Cunliffe put together the Pulitzer School of Journalism. It was just Jessie and the professor in a room putting it together with all kinds of other people coming with their input. But anyway, so she got to do that in 1911. And as soon as it was put together, another man came in, but he was a bear of a man, and she quit her job soon because she wasn't happy working for him because Professor Cunliffe had been such a nice guy. And so her next job was to help set the first minimum wage for women. If you can imagine, from $4 a week to $8 a week, and to try to get the children out of the of the factories. And her first job, she was sent to the silk stocking factory that she had walked past at Smith College every day to ride her horse. A horse. I don't think she took her horse. But anyway, and so she went there and she had to assess everything and interview the people and find out what they can do. And she helped create this decree. This one's 1917, but there was one before that. There was one earlier one where they had to increase the pay for the women working. And then after that, they sent her down to Washington, D.C. to set the first minimum wage for women. See, that was in Boston. And usually back then, Boston led the whole US. If it happened in Boston, then it could happen everywhere else. So they sent her down to become the first woman lobbyist in the Capitol at DC. And she created the minimum wage and got it through the Congress and helped every woman get paid more money, which was absolutely great. And so then what happened was she had to go into a man to have him get the vote through, and he was a bear of a man. He was a senator from Kentucky, and he she walked in and no, the secretary wasn't there, and she was wearing a gingham dress, and she waltzed into his office and he looked at her and goes, "How did you get in here?" She said, oh, well, the door was open, Senator. I just came on in. "And what are you doing here?" "I need your help. You're the only person who can help me. I have to get this bill through for minimum wage for women." And he said, "Why aren't you home having babies?" And she said, "Well, Senator, it's customary to have a husband before having babies, and all the good men are taken." And he laughed and relaxed. And then he said, "What do you do for fun?" And she said, "Oh, I go canoeing up and down the Potomac with my friends every weekend." And he went off. He said, "As a boy, I did that. We just had such a good time." And he went for half an hour on his exploits as a boy. And then he looked at her. He said, "What can I do for you?" And he became her advocate for the rest of her career in Washington, D.C. And if he liked something, the bill went through. Then, I can't believe this happened. This is such a great story. She took down the meat packers single-handedly. And what happened was she was going down the halls and looking at all the different rooms that were going on. And she went into a big room with a hearing, and it was the meat packers. And she knew all about that because of her father. And because her father had sent all of his cattle by train to the Kansas killing fields. And when they got there, the meat mafia, if you want to call them, lowered the price. He lost his shirt. He couldn't send them back home. And so he lost everything. And the next year, all his cattle sunk into the quicksand. So he became a realtor after that. And so she knew the whole story of this. So she went in, she started attending the hearings, and she would write a clean article every day. And she went to the Christian Science Monitor, which is a huge newspaper back then. And she had been in the group of the Christian Science group up in Boston. And she knew the women who worked there, and they weren't buying the big ads that all the other newspapers were, so they could put the article in. Otherwise, they couldn't, because the meat packers were putting these huge articles in all the main papers. So the woman started publishing all her articles without her name on it, because I think she might have been murdered if they had put her name on it. And she single-handedly took them down. And President Wilson had to pay attention, and he made a law that stopped the travesty of what they were doing by lowering the price once the cattle had arrived. And many other things, many other misdemeanors and things that they were doing. So anyway, I guess we talk about it here. Anyway, that's a real article that Mariah, who helped me put the book together, found. Then she started working with Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. Carrie Chapman Catt was her mentor was Susan B. Anthony. And when Susan B. Anthony retired, she handed the baton to Carrie Chapman Catt. So Carrie Chapman Catt was older. Uh, Alice Paul was the exact same age as Jessie. They were like in their 20s. And she met both of them and she became the lobbyist for the movement. And she had to work between them. They used to work together, but they had a falling out because Carrie wanted to be a parliamentarian and do everything by the right streams of ways. And Alice Paul had been trained by Emmeline Pankhurst in London. And I would have thought that Alice Paul was a hippie of the time, but she wasn't. She came from a very wealthy Quaker family, and she got her PhD, believe it or not, at the London School of Economics. So after marching with Emmeline and doing all the radical stuff, she came back to DC and rented a house with some money from a person who sponsored her, and opened it up and had all the women live there and eat there cafeteria style. And my grandmother ate there at lunch almost every day with her. And that's where they picketed across from the White House. And I found in my research, her diary, an interview she did where she said, yeah, I wasn't one who got fed through my nose in prison like the other women. I had done that in England with Emmeline, but the women who did it there got a lot of attention because if they died, his presidency would have been over, So anyways, they were very interesting. But Jessie always said, if we didn't have both of their methods, we would not have gotten the vote in 1920 because, here is Carrie Chapman Catt as a young woman working with Susan B. Anthony. So she became her main woman. And then here is Carrie Chapman Catt with her women who worked for her. And here's a letter from Carrie Chapman Catt. I found several from her to Jessie. I'm so very glad to get your spirited letter. You are the one person in the entire United States of whom I have heard lately who has not felt the tide of reaction setting in. So they worked very close together. Carrie Chapman Catt went clear across the United States, especially to speak to the Western states to get them to ratify the vote. And she took two speakers, and one of them was Jessie. So Jessie shared the podium with her all the way across the U.S., and they were very, very close. And then, did I miss? No, I didn't. Okay, good. And then, so what happened was they got almost enough states to ratify. They needed one more, so they all went down to Tennessee, of all places, where they were very against it. It was, of course, they didn't want the women to vote. And the story, you probably heard the story where suddenly one person decided to vote for them, and it was the deciding vote, the last one they needed. And it was Harry Byrne, young Harry Byrne. And all the men came up to him and thumped him on the back and said, "No, Harry, no, you were not going to vote for it. We're voting against it." And he said, "No. I got a letter from my mother, and she told me I had to help Carrie and put the rat in ratification." And that's an actual letter from a picture. And then all the men said, they got so excited, all the newspaper men, so they had to rent cars. They didn't all have cars. And they went up into the hills where she lived, and she was coming out of the barn with two milking pails, and she sat them down on the kitchen table and gave them cornbread and milk. And they said, "Why did you write that? Why did you tell Harry to vote for ratification?" And she said, "Well," because it was a funny letter. I should have had it here to read. But anyway, she said, "Well, our winters are long up here in the Kentucky hills and a lot of snow. And so we read Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's always funning with words. So I thought I could fun with words." And then all the articles came out. Everybody wanted to be part of it. And Jessie went back. She was in DC. They didn't take her to Tennessee because they needed someone to keep lobbying until the very end. And so she telegraphed Carrie and said, "Let's have a big party. I'll put it together. I can get the Poli Theater." And so she did. So Carrie said, "Okay, I'll stop there on my way back to New York." She had to go to her husband because he said she could do her women's work 6 months and then travel around the world with him for 6 months. He was very, very rich. And so she, avant-garde relationship back then. And so she put together the party at the Poli Theater. Everybody donated flowers. Then everybody who was against the amendment, the 19th Amendment, came to the party because now they wanted to be part of the success. And a very sad thing happened that day is that Jessie went to Carrie when she came back and went in the hotel and said, "Hey, Carrie, both you and Alice have worked on this so hard. You should let Alice come up and speak with you on the podium." And Carrie was a lovely woman. She was a lovely speaker. And she said, "Jessie, I just can't. There's too much water under the bridge. I'm sorry." And so the women from Alice Paul's group were seen, lurking around the back. But a great thing happened. Nobody knows this. It's in the book on page 124. I wrote it down here. It's not written anywhere else in the world how and where the ERA was created. Alice Paul and her women went up into the rooms and they sat up till 3 a.m. writing the first draft. And they were so frustrated that that's what came out. And I mean, they weren't. I don't know how frustrated where they were, but they wrote the ERA that night, the night of the celebration at the Poly Theater. And then she met Hugh, my great handsome grandfather, and she didn't want to get married. So they were just friends and they would go canoeing up the Potomac. They had a hideaway up the Potomac. And then, there was no housing back there in 1918 when the war hit. So this was a little bit before the vote happened. And they decided to have the first co-ed housing in DC, or probably almost anywhere. And they hired a maid and a housekeeper, and they all lived there together. A lot of the politicians. And then near the end of that, right when the war ended and right as they got the vote, kind of all about the same time, there was a huge article written about her as a prominent lobbyist getting married secretly and taking off for London. He had been given the job as the I can't remember the big important job in London. And so he said, "Well, you got to come with me and marry me or we're going to end here." So she decided to marry him, even though she wanted to stay and do her work. She loved her work. Marriage was not on her agenda. You know what I mean? And all the women were like, "You get to marry Hugh because he was the most handsome man there and lovely and he's witty and oh God, he was the greatest grandfather for me." And so everyone was jealous that he got to marry her. And one of the people who boarded in their co-ed housing was Benton McKay, who created the Appalachian Trail, a lot of it. And so that's him, and that's his memorial. And they were very interesting people because all of them canoed and hiked and they were very in shape. My grandmother was in shape. She had a career till 94 and then let her secretary go and got senile and died at 98. She was always in shape, always swimming, always walking. She was really in shape in her 90s as far as strength. And so anyway, she went to London with Hugh, and right away they decided we better learn about this London thing because it was freezing there and they hated it and they wanted to go home. And they got there at Christmas and they went on the Christmas ship, the Aquitania, and they got there and it was this thick yellow fog they had to walk through from the cold. And they couldn't even see people in front of them. They would bump into them. And they got so cold they had to go buy long johns. There's no heaters. There was no heaters in the hotel or the rooms they were given by the government later. And so right away, the first year, they decided they better go to the Fabian Summer School and learn about this. So they got in with George Bernard Shaw, and Jessie started being asked to speak there because everyone was supposed to give talks and then everybody was supposed to tear apart their talks. It was very interesting. And she got to know George, who was a terrible dancer, but he loved to dance. And he saw what a great speaker she was. And he asked her to be his speaking partner all over London. And then she met Lady Astor because Lady Astor wanted to invite Americans. She was an American that came much like from Jessie's childhood, but sort of mediocre, but she married the 5th richest man in the world, Lord Astor. And he was sitting in Parliament. And one day his father died and he had to go sit in the House of Lords. And he said, "Look," he said, "you sit in Parliament," he said to his wife, "while I go get rid of the House of Lords and I'll be back." And so he put her in his seat and they let him, and she's an American. And so he never came back. She sat there for 28 years and helped laborers, women, and children, and was best friends with George. They loved each other, even though he was quite a bit older than her. And here's a Fabian News. This is an article I found in her archives of her, an actual article of her speaking with George. And the newspaper article before, Jessie Butler's going to speak with George Bernard Shaw about he liked her because he was a teetotaler and she had a talk about prohibition. So then what happened was there was an article afterwards how George Bernard Shaw sat enrapt as he listened to Jessie Butler's talk. I mean, so I have the articles of that too. She had saved everything, which was so great. And then this is Lady Astor's home. She had one in town and one there, and she would have like 2,000 people at her party, and she'd feed them, and she didn't believe in drinking. She had a little side room that if people had to drink, they could go in there. But see, they were all Christian Scientists. She had 6 children without any doctor or nurse because she really believed in it. And then when Hugh said, now, Jessie, you're going to, because Jessie, Hugh's family came from Christian Science. He was a very great organist and pianist, and he played in all the cathedrals. They had these giant cathedrals in Chicago. And he said, Jessie, we're not going to have any doctors when we have babies. She went, there will be doctors. I'm so sorry. So she did, because she was scared to death of having the baby. So anyway, and then when my niece and I were going through the archives, we discovered 19 letters from Lady Astor and letters from Jessie back, because Jessie would do the ditto machine. And I can't believe it, because I looked all over and there's no letters from Lady Astor hardly in the world. And the biggest collection in the world I have. And her best friend was Lawrence of Arabia, and there's about 6 letters from her to him, I think, somewhere. I found them. And Lady Astor and Churchill had a battle. He couldn't stand her, and she couldn't stand him. And that's what she said. If I were your wife, sir, I would poison your coffee. If I was your husband, I would drink it. So it's a very famous, funny relationship. I don't think he came to her parties, but everyone else did. The guy who wrote Peter Pan came. Jessie got to meet everybody there. And then they got presented at the court of St. James, which was, it was one of the last years they were doing that. And it was the last year, 1928. And her friend said, Jessie, you really should be presented to the court of St. James because of your husband's position. They didn't let the ambassadors or anyone do it, just his position. Oh, trade commissioner, that's what he was. And he wrote a 1,000-page book on all the trade that was going on in England and Ireland, and he had a whole crew help him. I have the book here. I keep finding them, and I keep buying them. Anyway, so she said to her friend, I'm not a fluffy girl. I don't want to be presented. I'm not the type. Don't. And she said, Jessie, you'll never forgive yourself if you don't do it. But those dresses cost $2,000. I can get you the dress, and I can get you everything. So she found a dress for her for $40. And that's her dress. And it was one of the best dresses of the night. And then she carried calla lilies because she had heard or read that the Queen loved calla lilies. And the Queen really arched her eyebrows at her and really looked at her. And so they had to go take curtsy lessons. And then when they got to the thing, they had to step a certain way. And her husband was waiting for her over there. And the woman in front of her threw up, but the Chamberlain got his hat down in front of the woman's mouth just in time to capture it. Little stories like that. And then at the very end, they had King George, the stutterer and his brother. They were young men, and they were on the dais with the king and queen. And as soon as the king and queen left, they whooped it up and jumped off, she said, making a huge loud noise, not being proper at all. She tells funny stories. And then when she came back from England to Boston and started giving lectures and speech classes, everyone wanted a curtsy class. So she had to teach everyone in the group how to curtsy after she gave her talk about being presented to the court of St. James. And that's Queen Mary, who was very real and a lovely woman. She actually had a lot of things, and she would always have a garden party. Now, 9,000 people were presented over a series of like 3 months, and all 9,000 people were invited to the garden party. And so Jessie and Hugh went, and Hugh had to rent a tuxedo for it. And when they got there, they were serving, Jessie said, the best strawberries and Devonshire cream she'd ever had. And Hugh loved the king's champagne, even though he didn't drink a lot. And so suddenly she looked at Hugh and she goes, Hugh, look, she's talking to people. I've heard I can talk to her at this event. He goes, no, Jessie, back off. You're going to embarrass me. I'm going to lose my job, because she could always be a little embarrassing, sometimes. And so she said, no, Hugh, I'm going to do it. You just stand back there. Pretend you don't know me. So she walks up towards the queen, and she comes to the chamberlain, and she goes, do you suppose I could speak with the queen? He said, oh, yes, you're from America, right? Yes. Well, let me present you. So he presented her, and she went. The queen goes, oh, you're from America. Yes, Your Majesty. And, American women are terribly interested in you. Me? Why me? And she said, because they want to know what kind of housekeeper you are. And the queen tipped her head back and laughed uproariously and moved on. But the next day, the queen in the newspapers was an article called "The Queen as Housekeeper." So Jessie had inspired the queen, and the queen was known, she was German, so she was known to go through every kitchen, every cupboard, everything, and tell the people how to organize it. She would organize the castle before she left, and then she would organize the Scottish palace before she left. So she was known for that, and Jessie had read it, and Hugh came up to her afterwards and said, what on earth did you say to that woman? And she said, well, I asked her what kind of housekeeper she was. And where did you get that idea, Jessie? Well, I read in the paper that she loves to organize her own homes. And then Hugh, you see how handsome he was. He was so beautiful. So they had two children with doctors and nurses and midwives. And that's my mother, Rosemary, on the right, and my Uncle Richard on the left. And then they came back to America, and he was put, well, later on, he was put in charge of Social Security. First of all, he was made another trade commissioner, I think, up in Boston. And that's when Jessie started teaching classes and getting people interested in speaking and realizing all these people are speaking. If you watch the movie The Help, and that group of women are speaking, well, she was teaching them to speak for those kind of groups. And she realized they need a lot of help. So she had a huge 3-story house in Boston, and she had brought back all her furniture that she had bought in London and filled the whole house with the furniture. And so, but then pretty soon there was no jobs, and jobs were scarce. And Hugh got an offer to come down to DC and put together the entire Social Security department with 2,000 people under him for FDR. So they moved back down to Washington, DC. And there's a picture of him when she's little. And then he was on, all kinds of shows. And he's head of he was head of the Department of Commerce. I always forget which job he had. But anyway, so then they get back to DC, and they bought a little cabin in the Shenandoah Mountains because the Roosevelts had created these little homes for people to be able to afford housing, but they sold one to Hugh. And Jessie went and holed up all summer long. Can you imagine, you guys? And wrote her book in 3 months, Time to Speak Up, a 300-page book. And she called her friend from Harper and Collins, who had been in the Christian Science with her, because they were very networked. And she said, yeah, I wrote a book. It's going to be finished this week. And he said, send it up to me, Jessie. I'll publish it for you. Boom. Can you imagine that, you guys? Just going to publish your book. So Harper and Collins published her first edition, and then it was over and over. Then she took the book and she toured the whole United States. This is in 1946. You know how we're writing our books, a lot of us business people, and we're using them as our flags and getting our coaching. Well, she toured the whole United States and spoke in front of 200 to 2,000 people at every stop, and her book sold like hotcakes. And this is one of her events. And they love her book, and a very plain cover. And you can still find the book if you want to buy it on Amazon. Then she came back down and started speech classes for women in DC, and Eleanor Roosevelt would open her speech classes for her. Here's one of the invitations. And then she taught public speaking to Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt would often say, can you imagine this? Everybody just bring the whole class to the White House and we'll rehearse together. I just thought, before guards, before protocol. And so anyway, but in her book, Eleanor wrote a testimonial for the back, and Lady Astor wrote the foreword for it and all those letters they had together. And I think this is what Jessie looked like by then. And I have Eleanor's picture signed to Jessie up on my wall right there. And then Jessie went back to Shenandoah and learned how to can. This is actually an article. I couldn't find the whole article today, but here is all the canning jars she did. I couldn't believe it. She said she canned 50 chickens. Can you imagine that? I can't even imagine. I was thinking jam or something. But anyway, so she did, it's a whole wall. And she learned to can in one summer. And then she wrote Eleanor and said, Eleanor, I'm doing my bit for the war, because this was the World War II. And she said, I'd like to come to the White House and have a tea party and tell your ladies about it. And so Eleanor invited her to the White House, and they were all talking about what each one of them were doing for the war effort. And Jessie came and talked about her canning endeavors, which I'm so surprised she didn't learn to can in California. And then when she was older, in her 90s, a woman came and wanted to put her in this book, which has been used for all women's studies for years and years in many, many universities. And I was there while she was interviewing her. And Sherna Gluck, her name. And Sherna Gluck, I called her when she was 85 and asked her to write the foreword for Jessie's book. And she gladly did. And she and I hung out sometimes because we would follow Jessie around when she spoke all over Hollywood with Gloria, Steinem, and Marlo Thomas, and we got to take her. Sometimes they would send a limo for Jessie, but sometimes we drove her, and we got to go to like 2 or 3 of her speeches, or 4. It was really fun, and Sherna was lovely. She was a very sweet woman. Anyway, so she wrote this book, and she featured Jessie because Jessie's story was so amazing, and she was right there on the front line. And then there's Jessie at that age, and there's Jessie with Sherna and her biographer at that point. And Sherna was just sweet and lovely, and I've got to contact her soon again, hopefully. And Jessie would always wear hats. She always wore a big amount of jewelry and hats, and she always smelled a little funny because a lot of people back then that age don't want to take a lot of showers and baths because they're afraid they'll slip. This is me with my grandmother at that age. I was 18, 19, and I was following her around doing things with her, and of course being a teenager and a young adult and starting college. And that's my grandfather, who I love. I have his bust here in my house. They both had their busts made by that famous sculptor who made, you'll like this, Jan Michel, who made the St. Francis statue, the one you see in all the gardens. And then she got invited again to speak for this celebration for equality. They were raising money for the ERA, which was really having trouble. And so there was a garden party, and Sherna Gluck, when she wrote my foreword, said, Mila, you're not going to believe it. I live in the apartment building right behind where we had that party in Hollywood that time. And so anyway, so they featured her, they honored her. Gloria loved Jessie and her story, and everything. So I thought I put the article in. Anyway, so there's many more rare pictures in the book. If you don't have the book, get the book. It's your story of winning the right to vote. I even have a note from Bernard Shaw that I somehow found in a Texas museum slamming her book. She got most rave reviews, but he slammed her book. It was really funny. So, they always say reviews are good, bad, or ugly. So, and he just said, oh, I just think it's fluff, you'd have to read it. I put it in the book. I put so many other things in the book. Here's Jessie and Hugh in their 80s picketing. He's holding her purse while she's holding the picket sign. She never stopped, you guys. She was always working for us. She always kept reinventing herself. So we have to keep reinventing ourselves. And I'm tearing up again because I love my grandmother. Here's a timeline of her as a child, beautiful child, all the way up to when she was speaking for the ERA. And you can get your copy. Oh, and also if anybody wants to be in the Cinderella monologues, you have a story or I'll put some of these things up later with the thing. And then I've been having fun with AI lately. I was against it, but then I realized it's here to stay. So I decided to participate.